Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, my name is Angel and today we're going to be doing some thrift flips. I found these decorative wall hanging brackets at my thrift store and I thought these would be really pretty put up in between the opening of my dining room and my foyer. I started by giving both of these a light sanding. They did have like some sticky stuff on them, so I ended up having to get all of that off before I could paint these with 2 coats of my black chalk paint. And I did have to use a tiny brush to get in between the smaller details of these. You could also just spray paint them. Once they were dry, I mixed up a little bit of this folk art bronzed metallic paint and just a little bit of dark brown paint because I felt like it was just too light and too yellowish, so I wanted to make it more bronzy. Then I decided to use this Tim Holtz kind of paisley floral stencil on here. Now it wasn't big enough to cover the entire thing, so I'm actually just doing pieces of it at a time, and the nice thing about this stencil is it lines up perfectly. And I did end up only doing one side of each of these. So from one side, you will see the black, and from the other side, you will see this black with the paisley print on top of it. I may end up doing the other side eventually, but for now, once I was finished with this, I just sealed both of them and used some command strips to hang these in my doorway between my dining room and my foyer. For this project, I found this vase at the thrift store, and while I did like the size and the shape of it, I wasn't fond of the kind of farmhousey design on it. So I wanted to try something unique and different on here, and I grabbed this scrapbook paper that I really liked. It's a blackish brown floral paper with a little bit of script on it. Now you can use napkins or tissue paper or decoupage paper for this, but I really wanted to use the scrapbook paper, but it is a little bit thicker and a little bit harder to Mod Podge onto things. So I'm going to show you a little hack that I have for this to thin this paper down. Just use some packing tape and put it on the back side of your scrapbook paper. You want to rub this tape very good on the back of here. Make sure it's nice and stuck to it, and then you can just peel this off very carefully, and it's going to make your scrapbook paper a little bit thinner and easier to use with Mod Podge. So once I have my scrapbook paper thinned down, then of course I'm just going to use some Mod Podge in very random areas all over this vase, and I'm going to lay my paper down with a thin coat of the Mod Podge, and then I'll go back over it with a nice thicker coat. Now, if I could go back and redo this vase, I think I would have used larger pieces of the scrapbook paper and less of them. I just think that it would have looked better being able to see bigger pieces. But moving on to the next step, I am going to be using some Dollar Tree spackling, and here I'm just spraying some water into this because this spackling tends to be a little drier, and I really want this to be a paste consistency. If you leave it too dry, it's just going to crumble and make a big mess all over the place. So turning it into that paste consistency is going to help you be able to spread this onto the vase. Now, in general, I am spreading this all over the vase to not get rid of the pattern on it, but try to disguise it a little bit. And also, this is going to help cover the edges of that paper on here. So you'll want to spread this right up to the paper. If you get some on the edges of the paper, that's completely fine as long as you are covering all those edges. I'm also obviously trying to add texture to this, so I am going to take this spackling all the way up to the rim of the vase and just get it on there. Doesn't matter if it's really thick, let it dry completely, and then you can use some fine grit sandpaper to give this a light sanding to get off any of the clumpy excess. So once mine was dry and I had sanded it down a little bit, I'm going to go in and start doing a coat of black chalk paint on this. So just like before with the spackling, I'm going to do this black chalk paint all over the vase, obviously, but once I get up to the paper, I'm just going to carefully try to just cover enough of that spackling that goes onto the paper. I am taking the paint onto the paper, but trying not to cover it too much. And this is why I mentioned earlier, I think this would have looked so much better with larger pieces. Once my vase was all dry, then I'm going to go in with a combination of some browns and tans and some more of that black, and I'm kind of just going to start blending that lighter color with a little bit of the darker brown, and I'm going to get just a tiny bit on my brush, and I'm going to start making little marks all over this vase. Then without adding any more paint to my paintbrush, I'm just going to really start using that chippy brush and blending all of this in and going over the whole vase with just what was left over on that brush. Then I'll mix a little bit of that darker brown with some black and do the same thing. And I'm going to go over this entire vase again, just blending in those lighter colors that I made. Then just keep working it until you are happy with the color. For this project, I found this wood calendar frame at my thrift store, and I thought that this would be perfect to turn into a clock. I actually already had this clock stencil, which I got from Amazon, and it fit perfectly on here. So that's what I'll be using to actually do the design of the clock on here. But before I could turn this into a clock, I wanted to paint it. So I am using some Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster. And I'm just going to give this one good coat for now because I do want to decorate this a little bit. Since there was extra room on this calendar frame, I decided to use some of these scrap pieces of trim that I had from doing the project last week on that privacy window. And so I just cut down 2 pieces for that. And then this is a little wood decorative piece that I got from Amazon. So I am going to use all of these pieces on here to take up a little bit of room and give it a little more decoration. And I'm just using some wood glue to attach these pieces, and then I will let that dry for about an hour. Then I'll go back in with that plaster color and go over those little decorative pieces and also give this entire thing a second coat. Then I'm going to go in with some of my European Gold Rub and Buff and go over all of those little detailed pieces. I also ended up just using what was left over on my brush of the Rub and Buff and going along all the edges of the frame. Then I'm going to use that stencil that I showed you at the beginning to make the actual clock piece, but I accidentally kind of bent this stencil a little bit, so I am going over it with a little bit of Mod Podge first, just to try to prevent a lot of bleeding underneath of this stencil. I ended up going in with some black chalk paint to go over this stencil with a little stencil brush, and I'm just trying to dab as much of the paint off of the brush as possible so that I can try to prevent the bleeding. The Mod Podge trick didn't really do too great on this just because I had bent the stencil. So as you can see, I'm kind of having to hold this down as I'm doing it. I was actually kind of surprised when I took the stencil off that it looked as good as it did. I did have a little bit of bleeding near the top portion in places, and I ended up trying to go back in with that plaster color and go over a lot of the bleeding that you could really see. I didn't fix everything, but just the stuff that was really visible. I purchased this really inexpensive little clock kit from Amazon. It actually came with 3 different types of hands you can choose from, but all I had to do was drill out the center little piece here so that I could put this clock mechanism together. And that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.